The day Grace Miller came to sign away her marriage, her husband had already placed another woman in her chair. She stood just inside the private conference room of the Blackwood Grand Hotel, one hand gripping the handle of a worn baby carrier, the other holding a thin folder of papers that had been bent at the corners from being carried through too many buses, too many hospital waiting rooms, and too many sleepless nights. Outside, Manhattan moved behind the glass walls in glittering silence, all steel towers and yellow cabs, and people rushing as if heartbreak had never existed. Inside, everything smelled like polished wood, expensive flowers, and money. Ethan Blackwood sat at the head of the long table in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been made for him and no one else on earth. He did not rise when she entered. He did not ask about the newborn bundled in pale blue at her side. He did not look like a man seeing his wife for the first time after she had disappeared from his life with a swollen belly and no place to go. Beside him sat Scarlett Hayes, dressed in winter white, her diamond earrings catching the light every time she turned her head. There was a ring on her finger, large enough to announce victory without a single word. Grace noticed it immediately because once a much smaller ring from Ethan had made her believe forever could be simple. Scarlett smiled as if Grace were a late guest at a party she had not been invited to. "You finally made it," Ethan said, his voice calm, flat, and colder than the marble floor beneath Grace's shoes. Grace's body still ached from childbirth. Her coat was old, her hair was pinned back without care, and the baby carrier felt heavier than it should have, even though Oliver weighed barely 7 pounds. She had almost turned around 3 times in the lobby. Not because she was afraid of signing the divorce papers, but because some foolish part of her had wondered whether Ethan might see the baby and remember the woman he had once promised to protect. Then she saw Scarlett's hand resting close to his on the table, and that foolish part of her went quiet. On the polished surface between them lay 2 sets of documents. One was the divorce agreement, already marked with small blue tabs where Grace was expected to sign. The other was thicker, bound in cream paper with Blackwood family attorneys listed at the top. Grace did not need to read the title to understand what it meant. Scarlett was not only replacing her. Ethan had arranged for Grace to leave his life on the same day another woman prepared to enter it officially. Scarlett leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting to the baby carrier. "I hope he doesn't cry during this," she said softly. "These things are difficult enough without extra drama." Grace looked at her, then at Ethan, waiting for him to correct the cruelty wrapped inside that sweet voice. He said nothing. That silence landed harder than any insult. The baby stirred, making a small sound, and Grace's fingers tightened around the folder. She had spent nights feeding him under a flickering kitchen light in a rented room in Queens, whispering that his father was not as heartless as the world believed. Now, standing 15 feet from Ethan Blackwood, she was no longer sure she had been telling her son the truth. Ethan pushed the divorce papers forward. "Let's make this quick," he said. Grace did not move toward the chair they had left for her at the far end of the table, a chair that made her look like a stranger called in to settle a debt. Instead, she lifted her chin, set her folder down, and placed one hand gently over Oliver's blanket. Her voice was quiet, but it traveled through the room with the force of something that had survived too much to tremble. "I'll sign," she said. "But when I leave this room, Ethan, you will never again get to pretend you didn't know what you threw away." For the first time since she walked in, Ethan's expression changed. Only slightly. Only for a second. But Grace saw it, and so did Scarlett. Scarlett's smile faded for less than a breath, then returned brighter than before, polished and poisonous beneath the chandelier light. "That sounds dramatic, Grace," she said, folding her hands on the table as if she were the hostess of the room and Grace were an inconvenience brought in from the rain. "But today is not about speeches. It is about closure." Grace finally stepped toward the table, the baby carrier swinging gently beside her knee. She took the empty chair farthest from Ethan, not because they had placed her there, but because distance was the only thing in that room she still controlled. The leather seat was cold beneath her, and for a moment she remembered another chair in another Blackwood building, the night Ethan had asked her to marry him in private because, he had said, the world did not deserve to touch what was theirs. Now the world had touched everything. It had taken her name, her home, her place beside him, and nearly her belief that love had ever been real. Ethan's attorney, Mr. Caldwell, cleared his throat, and slid the agreement closer. Mrs. Miller, the terms are straightforward. Upon signing, you will receive a one-time settlement of $25,000, contingent upon strict confidentiality regarding your marriage to Mr. Blackwood. Grace looked at the paper but did not pick up the pen. $25,000. Less than what Ethan once spent on a weekend charity table without looking at the receipt. Less than the cost of one of Scarlett's bracelets. Enough to make a poor woman disappear, but not enough to make a mother feel safe. Mr. Caldwell continued, his voice smooth from years of turning cruelty into paperwork. You will vacate any remaining claim to Blackwood residences, accounts, family assets, and public association with the Blackwood name. You will also agree that the minor child in your care will not use the Blackwood surname now or in the future. The words seemed to change the air in the room. Grace's eyes lifted slowly from the contract to Ethan's face. He was watching her, but not like a husband, not even like a man who hated her. He looked at her like a business problem he wanted solved before lunch. You put that in writing? She asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. It is cleaner this way. Cleaner. Grace almost laughed, but the sound would have broken in the middle. There was nothing clean about giving birth alone after being turned away by the people who once called themselves family. Nothing clean about counting dollars at a pharmacy counter while choosing between pain medicine and formula. Nothing clean about staring at a phone that never rang back. Scarlett tilted her head, her perfume drifting across the table like a warning. Surely you understand why Ethan has to protect himself. There has been so much confusion about timing, about where you were, about who you were with. Grace turned to her. Say what you mean. Scarlett's eyes widened with false innocence. I only mean that no one here wants to punish a child for adult mistakes. But it would be unfair to attach Ethan's name to a baby when there are unanswered questions. This time Grace looked directly at Ethan, giving him one last chance to be better than the woman beside him. One chance to ask the question he should have asked months ago. One chance to look at the child sleeping a few feet away and wonder whether his own blood was wrapped in that blue blanket. Ethan looked at the contract instead. Sign it, Grace. The softness left her face. Something inside her, already cracked, finally sealed shut in a harder shape. She reached into her folder and removed a small document, folded once across the middle. She placed it on top of the divorce agreement, covering the blue signature tabs. Before I sign anything, she said, you are going to read the name on his birth certificate. Scarlett's fingers stiffened against the table. Ethan did not move. Grace unfolded the paper herself and turned it toward him. In clear black letters, beneath the seal of the city of New York, was the name Oliver Miller Blackwood. The room went still. Even Mr. Caldwell stopped breathing for a second. Ethan's eyes dropped to the page, and for the first time that morning, the billionaire who had prepared every document, every condition, and every goodbye looked as if he had just realized there was one thing in the room he had not prepared for at all. Ethan stared at the birth certificate as if the ink itself had reached across the table and caught him by the throat. Oliver Miller Blackwood. The name sat there in plain legal print, undeniable in a way Grace's tears, calls, and letters had never been allowed to be. Scarlett gave a small laugh, too, sharp to sound natural. Anyone can write a name on a birth certificate, she said. That does not prove anything. Grace did not answer her. She had learned that some people did not ask questions because they wanted truth. They asked because they needed time to build another lie. Ethan finally lifted his eyes from the paper. Why would you do this? He asked, his voice lower now, no longer as cold, but not gentle enough to be mercy. Grace met his gaze without blinking. Because he is your son. The words entered the room quietly, but everything seemed to bend around them. Mr. Caldwell shifted in his seat. One of Scarlett's perfectly painted nails tapped once against her glass, then stopped. Ethan's face tightened, like a man trying to hold a door shut, while something powerful pushed from the other side. You had months to tell me, he said. Grace's hand rested on Oliver's blanket. I did tell you. No, Ethan said, but there was less certainty in it than before. You disappeared. For the first time, Grace let the pain show in her eyes. I was removed from your life, Ethan. There is a difference. Before he could respond, Oliver stirred again. A tiny sound rose from the baby carrier, soft at first, then more restless, the fragile complaint of a newborn waking in a room full of strangers. Grace leaned down at once, her entire expression changing with the instinct of a mother who had not slept more than 2 hours at a time in weeks. She loosened the blue blanket around him and lifted him carefully against her chest. Oliver's face turned toward her coat, his cheeks pink from sleep, his fist curling against the collar of her blouse. The movement caused the blanket to slip lower from one shoulder. Grace was too focused on calming him to notice at first. But across the table, Mrs. Helen Moore noticed. The older woman had been standing quietly near the service door since Grace entered, half hidden behind the attorneys and hotel staff, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath the Blackwood grand name badge. She had served Ethan's grandfather before serving Ethan's father, and she had known the family long before Scarlett Hayes knew which fork to use at their dinners. Her face went pale as her eyes locked on the baby's exposed skin just below the collarbone. "Oh my lord," Helen whispered. Ethan turned sharply. "Helen." The room followed her gaze. There, on Oliver's small shoulder, was a faint crescent-shaped birthmark, no bigger than a dime, soft brown against his fair skin. Grace glanced down, confused by the sudden silence. She had seen the mark 100 times while changing him, bathing him in a tiny plastic tub, kissing him good night beneath the buzz of an old radiator. To her, it was just a part of her son. But to the Blackwood family, it was something else entirely. Helen took one unsteady step forward. "That mark," she said, her voice trembling with recognition. "Mr. Blackwood, your father had it. Your grandfather had it. You had it when you were born." Ethan's eyes moved from Helen to the baby. Every trace of color seemed to leave his face. Scarlett pushed back her chair so quickly the legs made a hard sound against the floor, though no one had touched her. "That is ridiculous," she said. "Birthmarks are common." Helen did not look at her. She looked only at Ethan. "Not that one. Not in that place. Your grandmother used to call it the Blackwood moon." Grace felt Oliver's warm weight against her chest, and suddenly understood why Ethan was staring as if the room had vanished around him. His gaze lowered to the baby, then rose to her, and for the first time since she had walked in, he did not look angry. He looked afraid. Scarlett reached for his arm. "Ethan, do not let this manipulate you." But Ethan did not seem to hear her. He stood slowly, his chair sliding back behind him, his eyes fixed on the tiny crescent mark that tied the child in Grace's arms to generations of men whose portraits hung in the hotel lobby downstairs. Grace held Oliver closer, not out of fear, but out of something stronger. Protection. Ethan took one step toward them, then stopped when Grace stepped back. That single step of distance hurt him more than any accusation could have. "Grace," he said, and this time her name sounded different, almost broken. She looked at him over their son's sleeping head. "Now you see him," she said. "But you were supposed to believe me before the proof was visible." Scarlett understood the danger before anyone else in the room found words for it. One small mark on a newborn's shoulder had shifted the entire balance of power, and for the first time since Grace arrived, Scarlett was no longer sitting like the future Mrs. Blackwood. She was sitting like a woman watching a locked door open from the other side. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Scarlett said, rising smoothly, though the color had not returned to her face. "Grace knows how sentimental your family is. She worked in your house. She heard old stories. She could have known about that mark." Helen Moore's expression hardened. "Miss Hayes, I told that story to family only." Scarlett turned toward her with a tight smile. "And staff talk. Everyone knows that." The insult landed quietly, but Helen did not lower her eyes. Grace did, not because she was ashamed, but because Oliver had settled against her chest, his tiny mouth relaxed, unaware that adults were fighting over the right to claim or erase him. Ethan remained standing halfway between the table and Grace, trapped between the woman holding his child and the woman who had spent months teaching him not to believe her. "Grace," he said carefully, "tell me why you never came to the office, why you never contacted my attorney, why you waited until now." Grace looked up at him. "I did come to your office." Ethan's brows drew together. "No one told me that." "Of course they did not." Scarlett gave a soft, wounded sigh. "Ethan, listen to yourself. You are letting one emotional moment rewrite everything." She disappeared for months. She was seen with another man. "You have photographs." At that, she reached into the slim white folder beside her and drew out several glossy prints, sliding them across the table with practiced confidence. Mr. Caldwell glanced down first. Ethan followed. The images showed Grace outside a midtown hotel at night, wearing the same green coat she still owned, her face turned away from the camera. Beside her stood a dark-haired man opening a cab door. In another photograph, his hand appeared near her back as she stepped inside. The pictures were distant, shadowed, convenient. Grace stared at them and felt an old exhaustion rise in her chest. She had seen Ethan's anger the night he believed those images. She had heard him say he could forgive poverty, inexperience, even fear, but not betrayal. That man was Daniel Price, Grace said. He was my cousin's husband. He drove me to the clinic because I was dizzy and could barely stand. Scarlett tilted her head. How unfortunate that every explanation comes after the fact. Grace turned to Ethan. I called you that night. Ethan looked away for half a second, and she knew the memory had found him. His phone on the table, Scarlett beside him. Grace's name flashing again and again until he turned the screen down. I called you 47 times over 3 days, Grace said. I sent messages. I sent the clinic address. I sent a photo of the ultrasound. The room became still again, but this silence was different. It did not belong to shock. It belonged to something beginning to rot in the open air. Ethan's voice was almost a whisper. I never received an ultrasound. Scarlett laughed lightly, but the sound shook at the edges. Because there was never one. Ethan, this is what she does. She waits until everyone is emotional, then she changes the story. Grace reached into her folder once more, but Scarlett moved faster, stepping around the table as if to stand between her and Ethan. Before she performs another heartbreaking scene, maybe we should remember what this day is for. She came to sign a divorce, not stage a family reunion. Grace did not step back this time. She kept Oliver secure in one arm and pulled a folded paper from the folder with her free hand. You are right, she said. I came to end this, but I will not let you end it with a lie. Ethan looked at the paper. Scarlett did too, and something sharp flickered across her face when she saw the clinic letterhead. Grace laid it on the table beside the photographs. That is the first ultrasound report. 12 weeks. The date is on the top. Ethan reached for it, but Scarlett placed her hand over his wrist. Do not, she said, no longer sweet. You owe me enough trust not to fall for this. That was when Grace finally smiled, though there was no joy in it. Trust, she repeated. That is a strange word from the woman who answered my husband's phone and told me he never wanted to hear my voice again. Ethan went completely still. Scarlett's hand slipped from his wrist. Across the room, Helen Moore drew in a quiet breath, and Grace knew the lie had finally made its first mistake. For the first time that morning, Scarlett had no instant answer. Her silence lasted only a few seconds, but in a room built on polished control, a few seconds were enough to sound like confession. Ethan turned toward her slowly. What does she mean? Scarlett lifted her chin. She means exactly what she always means, Ethan. She wants you to doubt me. Grace looked down at Oliver, who had fallen asleep again, his small hand curled against her coat, as if he trusted the world simply because she was holding him. That trust gave her the strength to continue. It was the night after your charity dinner at the Metropolitan Club, she said. I called because the doctor confirmed I was pregnant. I was scared, but I was happy. I wanted you to hear it from me before anyone else. Ethan's expression changed at the mention of the dinner. Grace could see him remembering the gold ballroom, the donors, the cameras, Scarlett standing close to him in a red gown while Grace stayed home, because Ethan had said the press was too intrusive. Your phone rang, Grace continued. A woman answered. She said you were busy. I asked her to give you a message. She laughed and told me I should stop embarrassing myself. Scarlett's mouth tightened. That is absurd. Then I heard your voice in the background, Grace said, and this time her own voice nearly failed before she steadied it. You asked who was calling. She told you it was no one important. Then the line went dead. Ethan looked as if something inside him had been struck in a place he could not protect. I do not remember that. Because you did not care enough to ask, Grace said softly. The words were not loud, but they landed harder than shouting. Mr. Caldwell shifted again, uncomfortable now that the divorce agreement had become something far messier than a transaction. Helen stood near the wall, watching Scarlett with the quiet anger of a woman who had seen too much pride destroy too many homes. Grace reached into the folder and removed another paper, this one creased at the edges. The next morning, I went to Blackwood Tower. Security would not let me upstairs. They said your office had instructions not to admit me. Ethan turned sharply toward Mr. Caldwell. Who gave that instruction? The attorney looked startled. I would have to review the building access records. Scarlett exhaled. Ethan, do not turn this into an investigation because she brought old papers and a sleeping baby. Grace placed the access denial slip on the table. They printed this at the front desk. The time is there. 9:16 in the morning. I waited in the lobby for almost 4 hours. I was dizzy. I had not eaten because I was afraid I would miss you if I left. Ethan stared at the slip, and the confidence that had carried him into that room began to fracture. Grace did not stop. She could not. Months of silence had pressed against her ribs for too long. When I finally went back to the house, my suitcase was already in the entry hall. Your assistant told me you wanted me gone before dinner. There was an envelope with cash, a temporary motel address in New Jersey, and a note saying I should not make this harder than it had to be. Ethan's face went pale. I never wrote that note. I know, Grace said. Scarlett's eyes flashed toward her. Grace caught it, and so did Helen. But at the time, all I knew was that your name was on the envelope and your driver was waiting outside to take me away. The room seemed smaller now, the glass walls no longer making it feel open, only exposed. Ethan looked at Scarlett, but she was already shaking her head, her earrings trembling with the movement. She is twisting every detail. You were devastated. You wanted space. I helped because everyone else was too afraid to tell you the truth. Grace laid the ultrasound report beside the access slip, then the birth certificate beside both. No, Scarlett. You helped yourself. The door to the conference room opened before Scarlett could answer. A woman in a navy coat stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase, her gray-streaked hair pulled back, her expression calm and unsparing. Grace closed her eyes for half a second in relief. Diane Foster had arrived. The attorney looked at the papers on the table, then at Ethan Blackwood. Good, she said. You have started without me. That means we can move directly to the evidence your fiancé hoped no one would ever see. Diane Foster did not rush, and somehow that made her entrance feel more powerful than if she had slammed the door. She crossed the room with the steady confidence of a woman who had spent 30 years watching rich men mistake money for truth, then set her briefcase on the table between Grace and the divorce papers. For the record, she said, my client will not be signing anything until every document in this room has been reviewed against the evidence we obtained this morning. Mr. Caldwell straightened, clearly offended. Miss Foster, this is a private dissolution proceeding. Your client was expected to attend alone. Diane looked at him over the rim of her glasses. Then your expectation was as careless as your agreement. Grace felt a breath leave her that she had not realized she was holding. Oliver slept against her shoulder, warm and soft, while the adults around him finally began to speak in the language Grace had been denied for months. Proof. Scarlett recovered enough to laugh once, though it came out thin. This is absurd. She brings in a lawyer at the last minute, waves around a few papers, and suddenly everyone is supposed to forget what she did. Diane opened her briefcase. No, Miss Hayes. We are here so everyone can remember exactly what you did. Ethan's eyes moved to Scarlett, then back to Diane. What evidence? Diane removed a tablet, a sealed envelope, and a stack of printed records clipped neatly together. First, hospital documentation from St. Agnes Medical Center in Queens. Grace Miller was admitted at 11:42 p.m. on February 3rd for severe exhaustion, dehydration, and pregnancy-related complications. She listed you, Ethan Blackwood, as her emergency contact. The hospital called the number on file 3 times. Ethan's face tightened. I never received a call. No, Diane said. Because the call forwarding on your personal phone had been changed earlier that evening. Scarlett went still. Diane tapped the tablet screen and turned it toward Ethan. Your mobile provider confirmed a temporary forwarding rule was activated from an authenticated device at 7:18 in the evening. That device was registered to an account belonging to Scarlett Hayes. The room seemed to lose sound. Even the hum of the hotel air system faded beneath the weight of that sentence. Scarlett stepped forward. That is not what it sounds like. Diane did not look impressed. It sounds like someone redirected a husband's calls on the same night his pregnant wife was taken to a hospital. Ethan looked at Scarlett as if he were seeing the outline of a stranger beneath a familiar face. You had access to my phone. You gave me access because you trusted me, Scarlett said quickly. Your life was chaotic. I helped manage things. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. Managed. That was what Scarlett called erasing a woman from her marriage. Diane continued, placing a second record on the table. Second, Blackwood Tower lobby logs. Grace arrived on February 4th at 9:16 a.m. She was denied entry under an instruction filed by Executive Guest Services. The request came from a staff portal login assigned to Scarlett Hayes. Mr. Caldwell looked sharply at Scarlett. Helen Moore whispered, "Dear God." Ethan's hand curled at his side, but he said nothing. His silence now was different from before. It was no longer arrogance. It was horror arriving late. Scarlett pointed toward Grace. "She had already betrayed you, Ethan. I was protecting you from humiliation." Grace opened her eyes. "By making sure I could not tell him he was going to be a father?" Scarlett's mouth parted, but no answer came. Diane placed the sealed envelope on top of the divorce agreement. Third, we have the original clinic ultrasound image, the appointment record, and a sworn statement from the nurse who attempted to contact Mr. Blackwood after Grace collapsed in the clinic lobby 2 days later. That nurse later received $5,000 through a shell payment connected to Miss Hayes. In exchange, she marked the follow-up contact as completed. Ethan took one step back as though the truth had physically moved him. Diane's voice remained calm. And finally, the photographs accusing Grace of meeting another man were purchased from a private investigator hired by Scarlett Hayes. The full, uncropped images show Grace being helped into a cab by a family member after a prenatal appointment. The cropped versions were sent to you. Scarlett's eyes shone with panic now, but Grace felt no satisfaction. Only a heavy sadness for the months that could never be returned. Ethan turned to Grace, and his voice broke around her name. "Grace." She held Oliver closer. "Do not look at me yet," she said softly. "Look at what you chose to believe." Ethan looked at the photographs, the call records, the hospital papers, and the ultrasound reports spread across the table. And for the first time in his life, the Blackwood name could not protect him from shame. He had built companies from failing ideas, negotiated with men twice his age before he was 30, and walked into boardrooms where people feared the sound of his silence. But standing in front of Grace with their newborn son sleeping against her shoulder, he felt smaller than he had ever felt in any room. Scarlett moved toward him, reaching for the version of him she still believed she could control. "Ethan, please think. She is using your guilt. That lawyer is twisting business records into some kind of fairy tale." Ethan did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the clinic report, on the date, on the grainy black and white image of the child he had never seen growing inside the woman he had promised to love. 47 calls, he said quietly. Grace did not answer. She did not have to. The number had already become a wall between them. Ethan remembered that week in pieces now, and each piece cut deeper than the last. Scarlett telling him Grace had been seen at a hotel. Scarlett handing him the cropped photos with tears in her eyes, saying she hated being the one to show him. Scarlett advising him not to take Grace's calls because a woman caught in a lie would only make the lie prettier. And he had listened, not because Scarlett was convincing enough, but because pride had made him eager to believe the version that hurt his ego less. It was easier to call Grace unfaithful than to admit he had been distant. It was easier to punish her than to ask why she sounded frightened. It was easier to let anger make decisions his heart should have questioned. "I need everyone out," Ethan said. Mr. Caldwell looked startled. Diane did not move. "My client stays where she chooses," Diane said. Ethan nodded once, accepting the correction like a man who no longer had the right to command anything in Grace's presence. He turned to Scarlett at last. "You need to leave." Scarlett's face changed completely. The softness disappeared, and something cold and desperate took its place. "You cannot be serious." "I am. After everything I did for you," she asked, her voice rising but still careful enough not to sound wild. "After I stood beside you when she humiliated you?" Ethan's eyes hardened, but there was grief beneath it now, not rage. "She did not humiliate me. I humiliated myself by believing you." Scarlett stared at him as if he had betrayed her, though betrayal had been sitting in her own folder all along. "You think this is about her? You think she came back because she loves you? She came back because that baby gives her access to the Blackwood trust." Diane's expression sharpened, and Ethan caught it. So did Grace. The words had left Scarlett too quickly, too specifically. Helen Moore stepped forward, her voice low. "How would you know anything about the trust terms, Miss Hayes?" Scarlett froze. Ethan turned fully toward her now. "Answer her." Scarlett swallowed. And in that small motion Grace saw the first real crack. Not fear of losing Ethan, but fear of being understood. Diane opened another document from her briefcase, slower this time, as if she wanted the room to feel every inch of the blade without ever raising one. That is actually the next matter, she said. 3 weeks ago, Miss Hayes requested a private review of the Blackwood family trust through an attorney in Delaware. The request specifically asked what would happen if Ethan Blackwood died without a legally recognized child, and what control a future spouse could claim after marriage. Ethan's face went still in a way that was worse than anger. Scarlett whispered his name, but it sounded useless now. Grace looked down at Oliver, whose tiny crescent birthmark had started all of this, and suddenly the cruelty made sense. Scarlett had not only wanted Grace gone, she had wanted Oliver erased before anyone could know what he was. Ethan looked from the trust document to the woman he had nearly married, then to the wife he had abandoned. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. Grace, I did not just fail to protect you. I protected the person who was destroying you. The confession hung between them, too late to be useful and too honest to ignore. Grace had imagined Ethan discovering the truth many times during those long nights in Queens, when Oliver would not sleep and the radiator clicked like an old clock, counting every hour she survived without him. In those imagined moments, Ethan always fell apart, and somehow that had once felt like justice. But now, watching him stand there with the full weight of his mistake finally reaching him, Grace felt no victory. She felt tired. Scarlett turned sharply toward Diane, her composure thinning with every breath. This is privileged information taken out of context. I had every right to understand the family I was marrying into. Diane closed the folder with a soft snap. You had a right to ask about wedding arrangements. You did not have a right to interfere with a pregnant wife's medical communication, restrict her access to her husband, purchase misleading photographs, or explore financial control that depended on a child being legally unrecognized. Mr. Caldwell looked down at the table, no longer willing to defend the agreement he had drafted. Ethan removed the cream-bound engagement contract from beside the divorce papers and tore his signature page free with a slow, deliberate motion that needed no anger to be final. The engagement is over, he said. Scarlett's lips parted. You are choosing her? Ethan looked at Grace, then at Oliver, and shame moved across his face again. No, he said quietly. I already failed to choose her when it mattered. Right now I am choosing the truth. Scarlett's eyes shone, but the tears seemed more furious than wounded. You will regret humiliating me. Helen Moore stepped to the door and opened it. 2 members of hotel security waited outside, summoned without drama, without raised voices, without the spectacle Scarlett would have used if the roles were reversed. Diane gathered the trust documents and passed a copy to Mr. Caldwell. My office will forward the full file to the appropriate civil authorities and the family court. Miss Hayes should retain counsel. Scarlett looked around the room, searching for someone still under her spell. No one met her eyes. Not Ethan. Not Caldwell. Not Helen. Not Grace. For a moment, her gaze landed on Oliver, and Grace instinctively shifted him higher against her shoulder. Ethan saw the movement, and the pain in his expression deepened. He stepped aside as Scarlett was escorted from the room, her white dress sweeping past the chairs, her diamond ring still flashing under the lights though it no longer meant anything. When the door closed behind her, the silence she left behind felt different from the silence she had created. It was not clean, but it was honest. Ethan turned back to Grace slowly. I know I do not deserve to ask you for anything, he said. But please do not sign today. Let me fix this. Let me bring you and Oliver home. Grace looked at the divorce papers, then at the man who had once been her home and later became the reason she had none. She placed Oliver back into the carrier with careful hands, smoothing the blue blanket over the crescent mark that had forced a room full of powerful people to see him. Then she picked up the pen. Ethan's breath caught. Grace, please. Her hand paused above the signature line. For one fragile second, the room seemed to wait with him. Then she signed her name in steady blue ink. Grace Miller. Not Blackwood. Not anymore. Ethan closed his eyes as if the sound of the pen had broken something final inside him. Grace set the pen down and turned the document toward Diane. I will not stay married to a man who needed evidence to believe I was worth listening to, she said. Ethan opened his eyes, and they were wet now, though no tears fell. "Then let me be his father," he said, "even if I have lost the right to be your husband." Grace lifted the baby carrier, feeling its familiar weight settle against her arm. At the door, she looked back once. Earn that right in court, in public, and in the quiet moments when no one is watching. That is where fathers are made. 3 months later, the house by the lake did not look like anything Ethan Blackwood would have chosen. It was small, painted pale yellow with white shutters, sitting at the end of a quiet road in Westchester where the mornings smelled like wet grass and maple trees instead of exhaust and money. The front steps creaked when someone walked up them. The kitchen window stuck whenever the air turned cold. The nursery was barely large enough for a crib, a rocking chair, and the second-hand dresser Grace had painted herself during Oliver's afternoon naps. Yet every corner of that house belonged to peace, and Grace had learned that peace was worth more than marble floors, private elevators, and rooms where love could be dismissed by a signature. Oliver was stronger now, nearly 4 months old, with round cheeks, curious blue eyes, and a habit of gripping Grace's finger as if he were making sure she stayed close. The court had confirmed what the birthmark and the records had already made impossible to deny. Oliver Miller Blackwood was Ethan's son and the legal heir recognized under the Blackwood family trust. Grace had not celebrated when the order came through. She had simply folded the papers, placed them in a safe drawer, and held her baby while he slept, grateful that he would never have to beg for the name others tried to take from him. Ethan came every Saturday at 10 in the morning, not with photographers, not with lawyers, not with gifts meant to impress a woman who no longer measured love in price tags. The first time, he brought diapers in the wrong size, formula Oliver could not use, and a stuffed bear too large for the crib. Grace had almost closed the door, but then Ethan stood on. Her porch in jeans and a dark coat, looking less like the billionaire from the conference room and more like a man trying to learn where to put his hands. "Tell me what to do," he had said. So she did. She told him to wash bottles. She told him to fold tiny onesies. She told him that Oliver liked being walked in slow circles after feeding and hated when anyone bounced him too quickly. Ethan listened to every word as if each instruction were a second chance he had no right to waste. Week by week, he changed. He stopped apologizing every 5 minutes and started showing up 5 minutes early. He learned the difference between Oliver's hungry cry and tired cry. He kept a spare burp cloth over his shoulder without being reminded. He spoke to the baby in a quiet voice, not about companies or legacies, but about clouds outside the window, squirrels on the fence, and how brave his mother was. Grace heard that last part once from the hallway and had to stand still until the ache in her chest passed. Scarlet haze disappeared from their world behind legal notices, canceled invitations, and the kind of disgrace no diamond could cover. Ethan made a public statement clearing Grace's name, plain and direct, without excuses. He admitted that false information had harmed his wife and son, and that he had failed them. Grace watched the video once, then turned it off before the reporters began praising his courage. Courage, she thought, was not admitting the truth after proof made denial impossible. Courage was carrying a newborn through winter with no one waiting at home. On a gray Saturday in late April, rain tapped softly against the lake house roof while Ethan sat on the living room rug with Oliver propped against his knees. The baby stared at him, serious and wide-eyed, then suddenly smiled. It was small, uneven, and perfect. Ethan went completely still. His eyes filled before he could hide it. Grace stood by the doorway with a folded blanket in her arms, watching the man who had once commanded towers lose himself over one tiny smile. Ethan looked up at her. "I am not asking you to come back," he said quietly. "Not today. Maybe not ever, unless you choose it. I am only asking to keep becoming someone Oliver can be proud of." Grace studied him for a long moment. Then she walked into the room, placed the blanket beside him, and sat down on the floor across from father and son. She did not forgive him that day. Forgiveness was not a door that opened because regret knocked loudly enough. But when the rain grew heavier and Ethan reached for Oliver's bottle, Grace did not tell him where it was. He already knew.